two Republican lawmakers have reintroduced legislation seeking to ban the enforcement of Sharia law in the United States. They argue the measure is necessary to preserve constitutional principles of American culture, meaning they don't want an encroachment of Islamic culture.
Why all of a sudden were people scared? And it's because of one man named David Yerushalmi, who, in his own words, wanted to introduce an idea of a scary Islamic law set to take over the United States. And that's how Sharia became a scare word in the United States.
You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good, and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan. Kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Welcome to a new series, The Muslim Women Project, where I feature 100 Muslim women of power and authority, shaping their destiny, community, and society at large. Dear friends, today I'm doing a segment on Sharia, which is one of the most misunderstood words in America. But here's the truth. 1,000 years ago, Muslim jurists asked a very profound question. What is the ultimate purpose of law? After centuries of legal reasoning, they concluded that the objectives of Sharia, as laid out in the Quran and the prophetic teachings, are to protect 6 essential things: life, religion, intellect, family, wealth, and human dignity. But notice something important. These weren't just for Muslims, because these laws are applicable to men, women, non-Muslims, everybody, regardless of their faith. And everybody deserves these protections, which means the freedom to think, the right to own property, the sanctity of life, family, and the dignity that comes with being a human being, which is now today called human rights. So here's the question. What actually happened? How did this legal tradition that is centered on protecting human dignity become so distorted in the American imagination that when someone says Sharia today, it gives people shudders? So how did we go from a 1,400-year-old framework of justice and compassion to a political scare word used to justify banning refugees, passing all kinds of unconstitutional laws? So that's what we're going to unpack today. I'm joined by someone who has spent years answering exactly these questions. Sumbul Ali-Karamali is the author of Demystifying Sharia. If you really want to know everything about Sharia, please get this book, How Sharia Works, What It Is, and Why It's Not Taking Over Our Country. She has a law degree and specializes in Islamic law, and she's here to help us separate fear from fact and understand what Sharia actually means for Muslims and also for the rest of us who are confused. So Sumbul, welcome to Wise Women.
I am honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get right to it. I don't know if you have been reading the latest news, but 2 Republican lawmakers have reintroduced legislation seeking to ban the enforcement of Sharia law in the United States. And of course, they argue the measure is necessary to preserve constitutional principles of American culture, meaning they don't want an encroachment of Islamic culture, whatever that means. So their proposal is called No Sharia Act, which was announced this week by none other the most Islamophobic representative from Florida called Randy Fine and his cohort from Texas called Keith Self. So there is a lot of hysteria about this, and that's why I brought you on as a guest to really debunk all this rubbish that we're hearing about Sharia. What does it actually mean, and how is it different from what most Americans think it means?
Yeah. When I wrote my first book, which came out in 2008, it was an introduction to Islam, but I only spent maybe a paragraph or 2 on Sharia because Sharia is an academic term. It's not something that Muslims grow up discussing, right? Muslims grow up just learning how to pray and how to fast and giving to charity and doing their homework and being respectful to their parents. Sharia came into the public discourse really intentionally in 2010. The year I went to one of my Stanford college reunions. I was there in the bookstore with my books, looking hopefully around, hoping that somebody would buy a book. And this older couple there for their 50th reunion came and said to me, "You look like someone that we could talk to. We're really afraid that Sharia is taking over the United States."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was like, okay. And I said, actually, it can't because we have the Constitution and no religion can take over the United States. We have two famous clauses in the Constitution, the Establishment Clause, which means that the government cannot favor one religion over another, and the Free Exercise Clause, which means
Right.
that people can practice any religion they want as long as it's not against American law and public policy. So I told this to this older couple. I said, no religion can take over the United States. And they said, Rush Limbaugh said it can. And they walked away. And obviously, they didn't buy a book.
I wish they had bought your book. They would have understood what it actually meant, right?
I know. In 2010, what changed? Like, why all of a sudden were people scared? And it's because of one man named David Yerushalmi, who, in
Hmm.
his own words, wanted to introduce an idea of a scary Islamic law set to take over the United States. And he
Hmm.
started going to state legislatures and saying, you have to pass an anti-Sharia legislation, otherwise Sharia is going to take over the United States.
Yeah. And
This
Muslims
is
are going to take over as a result of that, right?
He's a lawyer. He knows better, but he didn't care
Hmm.
because he just
Yeah.
wanted to introduce the idea and he wanted
Hmm.
to scare people. And
Right.
that's how Sharia became a scare word in the
Hmm.
United States. And last I checked, at least 14 states had passed anti-Sharia legislation.
Yeah.
It's not only unnecessary, it causes more problems
Yeah.
because these laws are unconstitutional. They have
Hmm.
been struck down. They violate not only the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, they also violate the Supremacy Clause and the Contracts Clause because
Yeah.
Muslims are not allowed to enter into contracts under Sharia, even if those contracts are okay under American law and public
Right.
policy. So that
Yeah.
that violates the Contracts Clause. So they cause all sorts of problems. And then for a while, things died down. But as you mentioned, they've suddenly started bringing these things up again.
Dial up again.
And
Raise the temperature.
yes, and it's totally for political gain. Human history is replete with situations of scapegoating in order to get political power. That's what people do. Politicians know that if you scare people, they will rally around you and vote for you. And of course, midterm elections are coming up. And this is something that is very intentional, that
Yeah.
they start stoking fear. Muslims are only 1 to 2% of the American population, and it's easy to scapegoat us. And that's what's happening.
Let me go back to the basics because I'm glad you gave me this backgrounder. What
Mhm.
exactly does the word Sharia mean in Arabic?
So, one of the problems with Sharia and discussions about Sharia is that it doesn't have a fixed meaning. So, Sharia literally in Arabic means the road to the watering place, the
Hmm.
path to water. In religious terms, it means the path that you want to be on.
Hmm.
Islam originated in the desert, so you want to
Yeah.
be on the path to water. In
The
terms of
mirage, the paradise, water.
paradise, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in religious terms, it means the path that God wants us to be on, the straight
Mhm.
path, the righteous path, the path that we want to follow.
Mhm.
So, what does that mean though? How do we know how to follow the
Right.
path of God? For early Muslims, they had the Quran, which is
Mhm.
the holy book of Islam, and the Sunnah, which was the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. And they looked at those religious sources to find answers to their questions of what to do to be on the path of God, on the
Right.
path of Sharia. And if they didn't find those answers, they started interpreting the religious texts. And over the years, filled thousands of books of interpretations on the religious texts. This body of interpretive literature is called fiqh.
Yeah.
What's amazing about the fiqh is that it's not a set of rigid rules like is advertised. Fiqh is an assortment of opinions and debates and arguments and contradictions, all of people trying to guess what the way of God is and
Yeah.
interpreting the religious text. The thing that I find most amazing is that all the scholars, as long as they were learned scholars who followed the correct methodology, their conclusions were considered correct, even
Mhm.
if they contradicted other people. So if
Yeah.
I were an Islamic scholar, a mufti, and someone asked me a question and I interpreted the religious texts and I came up with an answer, but then somebody else did the same thing and came up with another answer, we would both be right. I think it's important to distinguish between Sharia, path of God, and
Mhm.
fiqh, which is the man-made religious interpretations on the religious texts.
So I
Because
want to go back to Sharia because I want you to explain to people in the context of America, for instance, what does it mean in daily life? What are Muslims supposed to do that would be Sharia compliant?
So this is where it gets tricky when people discuss it, because sometimes Sharia refers to the path of God. Sometimes people use Sharia to refer to the Quran and the Sunnah and the fiqh all together. And sometimes they're using Sharia to refer to Islamic jurisprudence, like the
Of
whole
law.
system of religious interpretation that was in place for 1,000 years as a legal system in Muslim
Mm,
lands. So it's confusing, right? Because it depends on what we're talking about. So when you say, for example, people say, I'm going to follow Sharia in my private life, they're really referring to the Quran and the Sunnah and the fiqh. And they're saying, okay, I'm following the religious guidelines. And these religious guidelines are totally pluralistic. So
yeah.
this is also the amazing thing about the Islamic legal system that was based on Sharia. There were lots of different legal outcomes on one set of facts. So, for example, if a woman wanted an abortion, she could go to an Islamic scholar, a mufti or a mullah. And in fact, women were muftis too in Islamic history. It wasn't just men. A woman who could go and ask one of these scholars, can I get an abortion? Depending on who she asked, the answer would be different. So some Muslim scholars said, no, never. Some said, only in the first 120 days. Some said no, except if there was danger to the mother. Some said no, unless there was like rape, incest, some other
Mm-hmm.
egregious factor or danger involved. Some said, yes, you can until the soul enters the body.
Mm-hmm.
So the Muslim woman asking this question could choose from any of those learned scholars which answer she thought she wanted to follow.
Yeah.
So the law was pluralistic and it was also flexible because, which is also the opposite of what we hear about Sharia, because the Islamic scholars took into account factors like time and custom and geography. As time progressed, the law also was able to change because it would take into account custom now as opposed to 50 years ago. So
Yeah.
we had a pluralistic, flexible law that was in place for 1,000 years. As a Muslim now, what we do is look at these different fiqh rules, or
Mm-hmm.
someone who understands the fiqh rules, and decide, okay, in my life, what is it that I believe is the right thing to do to be Muslim? And often it's really easy. There's a consensus that Muslims shouldn't eat pork, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah.
a consensus we shouldn't drink alcohol. Okay, so I've done that. That's easy. There's some are very cut and dry, but there was a consensus really only on 1% of the issues throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
99% of Islamic legal issues had a variety of opinions. And like head covering is one example. Should I cover my hair or shouldn't I as a Muslim woman? What do I do? I should go and read the opinions of various scholars to
Mm-hmm.
understand. When I was growing up, we didn't have a mosque
Mm-hmm.
and a real imam in driving distance. So I asked my dad. He said the idea was safety, and I think it would make you more unsafe to be conspicuous. And so I don't think you should. So that was
Mm-hmm.
his opinion. But you could go to really learned scholars. There was a debate in Egypt between two very high level scholars, and they debated whether it was a woman's duty to cover her hair or not. And one said it was, and one said it wasn't. And they were both learned, both respected Sharia scholars. They based their opinions on foundational texts and they reached different conclusions. And so I, as a Muslim, can decide, okay, I'm going to follow that opinion or the other opinion.
One of the things that Muslims are worried about when they listen to this talk about ban Sharia, part of us expressing what is in the Quran, we have to pray, fast, give charity, and that's all part of going towards the watering hole, right? How do you get closer to God unless you are doing all these ethical things, right?
Right.
And the kinds of things that you talked about, the pork and everything else, but those are prohibitions, right? But we're talking about the things that we do to get closer to God and to be have more God consciousness. So that to me is like the core of what we're supposed to do. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, yes, of course. So there was consensus on, I'm sure people have heard about the 5 pillars of Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
fasting, we all have to fast. We healthy adults,
Mm-hmm.
to make very clear, because people have often asked me about this. Healthy adults should fast during Ramadan. We pray 5 times a day, differently depending maybe on which division of Islam we belong to. So we fast, we pray, we give to charity, which is required. We believe in God and the Prophet Muhammad. And once in a lifetime, we go to Mecca, which is now in Saudi Arabia, to perform the pilgrimage. Those are the core rituals that all Muslims are supposed to follow. All of Islamic law, although that Sharia is not law the way we think of law. It's not enforceable. It's not rigid and black and white. But all the fiqh was meant to promote benefit and prohibit harm. And in order to do this, the early Islamic scholars developed the goals of the Sharia, which is called the maqasid al-Sharia. And they decided that every guideline, every rule had to promote these core goals of the Sharia. And these were the protection of life, family, religion, property, and resources, and intellect.
Also human dignity. Yeah.
Human dignity, yes. It again depends on how you characterize them, but all of Islamic rules had to further those goals.
Yeah.
And these rules in Islam that sometimes people fixate too much on, there were always exceptions. And the exceptions were things like hardship. If it was too hard to do something, then God was merciful and forgiving and you didn't have to do it. So for example, the elderly, someone who is sick, someone who is pregnant, children are not supposed to fast. The same thing with prayers. If you're traveling, you don't have the same requirements of prayer as if you're at home.
There are exemptions for all these things. It's so flexible.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly.
Even pork. But if you're literally starving and there's nothing else to eat and you're going to die if you don't eat something and there's only pork, then you can eat it.
Yeah. Thank you very much for clarifying that. So now let's get to what Americans hear. When they hear Sharia, they often imagine punishments like stoning and amputation. I know that you have an entire chapter in your book where you describe all the scary stuff. Can you explain what were the original evidentiary standards that get omitted from these portrayals in the media?
By the time I was 11 or 12, somehow my classmates knew that Muslims chopped off hands for theft. It's like they hardly knew what Islam was. They didn't even know where India was when I was in 6th grade. Somehow they knew that. When I watched Aladdin for the first time, I was so appalled. There's the princess who is hungry. She goes into the marketplace. She doesn't realize she has to pay for an apple, and so she grabs an apple, and immediately the apple seller is ready to chop her hand off. And I just thought, oh my God, where is her trial? You can't do that to anybody.
And stealing when you're hungry is not even theft.
No, it is not. It is
It's like
not.
your family is supposed to get whipped if you have
Right.
not.
There were so many exceptions for theft and for some of these other crimes that they were almost never applied. The Quran, it specifies death for one offense. And that is remarkable, really. So we hear about stoning for illicit sex, and we hear about hands getting chopped off for theft. So let's just take the sex first. The penalty in the Quran is not stoning, it's actually flogging. And you might say, okay, that's not a good thing either. But remember, this was the 6th century. So how did stoning get into the literature? It might have come from other laws because in Judaic law, there was stoning for adultery. These crimes were deterrent crimes. Police couldn't go out and enforce the law. And so they made the punishments really harsh to scare people into complying. They're called homiletic crimes, which were crimes that were meant to deter and not actually to be applied.
So stoning is not in the Quran.
Stoning is not in the Quran.
We just applied it because that was the prevailing punishment in those days.
It came into the fiqh. So when someone being stoned for adultery, it's extrajudicial. It's somebody taking the law into their own hands, which is murder under Islam. It's some village elder who kills somebody, or a couple running away in Afghanistan whose family shoots one of them because they think it's allowed. That is not ever Sharia. Sharia always requires a trial and procedure before you can apply any sort of punishment, however minor.
So vigilantism is not something that you can just take matters into your own hands like they do in Afghanistan, like you mentioned. That's honor killing. There's nothing honorable about that. It's complete murder.
That is murder under Sharia. And in fact, Sharia has no concept of honor killings. There are a few countries in the world who do punish people by execution. Iran does this, Saudi Arabia does this. Under Islamic law, what you need to bring an action against a man or a woman, this is not a sexist crime, it applies equally to men and women. What you need to bring an action of illicit sex against a man or a woman is that you have to show 4 eyewitnesses to the act of intercourse itself. And we're not talking about seeing 2 people in a bed. You
Yeah.
have to see every detail of the intercourse itself. And it gets really embarrassing to talk about because they went into very great detail about how you had to see penetration like a bucket going down a well.
Oh my God.
Oh.
Jeez. Okay.
Yes, and so the 4 eyewitnesses have to have seen it with their own eyes.
The
They,
bucket going down the, I like that
yes,
expression.
or an eyeliner going into its case.
Oh my God. You're kidding.
So they were very explicitly strict about what you had to see.
So if you did
And
something in your privacy between two people, it's consensual. But if you did something in town square, then it's prohibited because it's affecting society, correct?
that is probably the only time you could ever have 4 eyewitnesses to
It's
intercourse
not like an
fornicating in
orgy or
public.
something like that.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
why would you
the
do
kind
that?
of stuff that's happening in Epstein. All right, so maybe we
Yeah,
should.
but I have to tell you, that's not enough. It's not enough just to have 4 eyewitnesses. The prosecution has to prove that
Yeah,
they are trustworthy, and the testimony of the 4 witnesses has to be exact in every detail. And if one of them is different, the whole thing gets thrown out.
yeah.
Even
All
if you
right.
can bring all that, the defendant still has
Mm,
all sorts of defenses. The defendant can claim mistake, like, oh, I thought it was my husband. Or they can claim duress, oh, I was raped. Or they
mm,
can claim coercion, like I was blackmailed into sleeping with him. And these were all
mm,
defenses, and the judge would throw out the case. Oh, and my favorite, repentance.
mm.
Who, if you said, I'm sorry, I won't do it again, the judge would say, okay, that's a defense to this crime, and he would
Right.
dismiss the case. Even by some cosmic convergence, you could not bring, if you could bring the 4 eyewitnesses, you didn't have any defenses, you couldn't bring
Mm,
yourself to repent.
mm,
Even then, the court could throw out the case on the basis of doubt.
mm. Yeah.
Now, in our system, in our criminal cases, in the American system, you need to prove that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that is not 100% certainty. It's just certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. But in Islamic law, you have to have 100% certainty. You have to have 0% doubt. And the judges, when they were looking at these cases, always took very seriously a legal maxim from the Prophet said, ward off the hudud, which are these particular crimes.
Meaning maximum punishment that's mentioned in the Quran.
Yes, there are
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
4, possibly 5, depending on your interpretation.
Yeah.
But yes, there are very few of them. But
Mm,
he said, ward off the hudud as much as you can. And if you can let the accused go free, then you must do so. And the judges took that very seriously. And so they would go to great lengths to say, no, there's doubt. Jonathan Brown is a professor of Islamic law, and he tells some really great stories about the kinds claims that people made. There was one woman who was found to be pregnant after her husband had died in a war. And so a claim was brought for adultery against
mhm,
her. And she said, no, because her husband was miraculously resurrected and visited her every Friday,
mhm.
even after he had died. And the judges consulted the Islamic scholars and they said, yeah, could happen. So they threw out the case because they said, okay, there's too much doubt that this woman actually committed adultery.
Mm.
Or women would sometimes say, I was drugged with sweets and I didn't know that someone was having sex with me. And
Yeah.
then that introduced doubt, and then they would throw out the case. So it was virtually impossible to
Was
actually
this
apply these
also
punishments.
Sumbul, was this also called the sleeping child? The man would travel and they would be gone for maybe a year or two. It wasn't like taking a plane. So there's an assumption that she could have been raped. She could have been forced into
Mhm,
sex by some member of a family or something like that. And so
mhm.
it's beyond her control. I remember Romina Lawal case in Nigeria. She eventually got off free because they said it was a sleeping child.
Yes. So pregnancy of a woman whose husband was not around for whatever reason or was dead, pregnancy was not proof of adultery in
Yeah.
Islamic law. And they allowed, like the Maliki school, allowed a child to be born for 5 years after widowhood. And now, were they stupid?
Mhm.
No, they were not stupid. They
They were just
knew
realistic.
they knew pregnancy did not last more than 9 months for the most part.
Mm,
But They were warding off the hudud. These were deterrent crimes. They were not meant to be applied. So it's the same kinds of procedural limitations on theft. It was hardly ever the case that someone got their hands amputated. Usually in Islamic history, the punishment was flogging for theft. You had to prove 2 eyewitnesses to the act of theft. The accused could always say that it was his own property, and that introduced the doubt. And then there's a huge long list of limitations on what the object could not be that was being stolen. It was, again, virtually impossible to apply these penalties. In fact, and even confession. Confession was not enough either. And you could always take back your confession and then they were throughout the case. So these penalties were not applied. They were almost extinct. And then in the 20th century, the state of Saudi Arabia was formed in the 1920s. And when they executed a woman for adultery, there was shock throughout the Muslim world because nobody had been executed for adultery in a very long time, and in some places never. To give you an example, in the 600 years of the Ottoman Empire, only one person was ever executed for adultery, and that was a political case and very controversial. So when these modern countries execute people for adultery or cut off their hands for theft, it is not Sharia. If you are following Sharia, you cannot apply these penalties. They were not meant to be applied on the parts of these countries. It's a show of force. It's to cow their populations. It's to give themselves legitimacy to say, we're Islamic.
Legitimize their Islamic credentials, right? Doing in Afghanistan, everything is Islamic, Islamic, Islamic. Meanwhile, it's the most un-Islamic thing that they're doing.
You're absolutely right. It is shameful. It really bugs me when people say that Sharia should be reformed because it makes absolutely no sense. Because Sharia had internal methodologies for development and reform itself. What these people should be saying is that the countries that are imposing these harsh penalties need to stop because that is not Sharia. The legal system that was based on Sharia was a ground-up system. It wasn't imposed by the state. It was muftis on the ground listening to the people who developed these rules. And then the qadis, the judges, would enforce the rules in all Islamic schools. The women could be qadis, judges. But all of that died with colonization. So there is no Sharia in the world anymore. So when someone says, oh, Sharia is the law of the land in a Muslim country, that is not the case. Sharia is not the law of the land anywhere in the world. Most Muslim majority countries have constitutions and civil codes. They, like Iran, just takes Islamic sounding provisions and tacks them on to its civil code. That is not Sharia.
In some countries, they have French laws, like honor killing in Jordan has a basis in French law.
Yes, in fact, when the British colonized India, they found Sharia was too soft on crime and too lenient. For example, if somebody commits a homicide, then the victim's family has 3 options. They can demand that the murderer be put to death, like our death penalty. They can demand monetary compensation, like if in our system, when we bring a wrongful death suit against someone, or they can forgive the murderer. And forgiveness is always the best option in Islamic law. So the British were appalled by this. And so they overturned a lot of these judges' decisions and put the murderer to death. And they also introduced this idea of provocation, which is like an honor killing. It was the British who introduced this into Sharia, the way that fiqh was applied in India. So there were cases where they had actually convicted men who had killed their wives. And the British judges said, no, there was provocation, so we're going to overturn that. And in Europe, it's called a crime of passion. It's really interesting because if you call it an honor killing, they've done surveys. People are really against it. They think it's a horrible thing. But if you ask them, what do you think of crimes of passion? Oh, we understand.
It's that man's club that's deciding what is okay for men and what is not okay for women. Hey, we're seeing this in Epstein right now. How they defend one another, support one another, how they continue the exploitation of women. It's unbelievable.
It's shocking and not shocking that he was just able to get away with so much, even in our legal system, that they just let him off because he was wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, the story hasn't ended yet. We talked a lot about all this stuff happening in Muslim majority nations is and how it's supposed to be applied. And so, what is this thing about Muslims are here to take over America with Sharia law? Even
So,
though, of course, there's zero evidence of this happening. Why do you think this narrative is so powerful?
so this started with the Islamophobia network in the United States, a loosely organized network of organizations and individuals. David Yerushalmi, who started this whole Sharia scare, is part of this
Mhm.
Islamophobia network. And what this network does is pretty much disseminate false information about Muslims.
Yeah.
And they do this for a number of reasons. Some of them probably truly are afraid of Muslims, just like people were afraid of communists in the
Mhm.
1950s.
Yeah.
Some of them want to influence US policy in the Middle East. And a lot of them are making money off it because it's
Mhm.
profitable. So that's why they do it. Like hundreds of millions of dollars have been funneled into this network over the
Mhm.
last decades.
Yeah.
Yerushalmi wanted to influence US policy in the Middle East. And one way to do that is to make all Muslims scary and reprehensible. And so bringing up Sharia as a scare word was his way of doing that. It is not a new tactic for lots of minorities in American history. They have been portrayed as alien, as not loyal to the United States. When JFK was running for president, people were saying that he was going to be more loyal to the Pope than to America, or that Catholics in general were going to be more loyal to the Pope than to their country. Same thing, like this Sharia scare portrays Muslims as unable to follow American law and the US Constitution. What they're trying to do is portray Muslims as having to follow Islamic law instead of American law, and that is nonsense.
Yeah, it's like it's our obligation to follow every piece of this, not just the personal worship that we talked about, the five pillars, but we're supposed to follow everything. I remember this. I was at Aspen Institute many years ago, and this woman came up to me, and that's when the Sharia word had entered the lexicon. And she says to me, I don't want Sharia in this country. And I said, why? She said, I'm going to have to wear a burqa.
Yeah, I
So this,
know. It's like,
so this is an
okay,
American
people.
woman at Aspen Institute. I
That's
said, who is
amazing.
going to force you to wear the burqa? Oh, they're going to force it on all of us. The burqa is going to
Who
come
is
up.
the they? Is it the 1% of Muslims in this country?
Yeah, I
They're
mean,
gonna,
I'm,
it's just very silly, but that's what they're doing. Oh
yeah.
no, burqas, Arab dress. Yeah,
Stoning is going to
it's
come,
really,
hands going to
and
get cut off.
the thing that's ironic is that Sharia says that Muslims have to follow the laws of the country in which they live,
Right.
whether it's an Islamic government or some other government, that you are not supposed to try to overturn the government of that country. When I study Sharia, it is not that different from American law. It is
Mm,
just not that different. The areas where it's different are the old penalties, which we've already talked about. But other than that, like other legal systems, it's just concerned with fairness and justice.
mm,
Noah Feldman is a professor at Harvard and he teaches Jewish and Islamic law. And he says that for 1,000 years, Islamic law offered the most humane and liberal principles available anywhere in the world.
mm.
And it is true. And we don't know what the Sharia-based legal system was like because it hasn't been around for 200 years after colonization.
Yeah.
What happened under colonization is that Jewish law and Christian law were allowed to continue to develop and modernize in response to the Industrial Revolution. But Islamic law or Islamic guidelines, Islam in general, was not able to develop and progress because it was under colonization.
Yeah.
Muslim educational institutions were dismantled, they were unfunded. In Egypt, there was free education for both boys and girls until the colonizers came and then they got rid of it. People don't realize 90% of Muslim lands were colonized. So that's what happened. The development of Islamic law was stultified under colonization, and the entire system of Sharia courts, the flexibility and pluralism of the legal system went away under
Yeah.
colonization.
Whole body of sophisticated law with five schools of thought having various interpretations because law was also informed by custom and culture and had to be incorporated into it. It was so sophisticated and then it was dumbed down and
Codified.
it
That
was
is
codified. I think I read in your book that by taking away our Waqf system did away all the educational institutions that seriously impacted women's education.
There are a couple of different things that happened. When it came to the Sharia legal system, colonizers either just dismantled it, or like in the case of the British in India, they took it, summarized it, and put it into a code so that British judges could apply it. And that was the end of it, because here was this case law system. It was varied and pluralistic, and it had to do with interpretation of cases. And instead, they put certain results, but not all of them, in a code that they applied to everything. And what happened, the nuances got left out, the various possible legal conclusions got left out. Very often it was the rights of women that got left out, because these were all men doing all of this codification. Even the Ottomans, under pressure from the West, tried to codify Sharia, and the same thing happened. Like, you codify it, it goes away, because that is not Sharia, a code that you apply to everybody. So, for example, all the myriad ways that a woman could get a divorce got left out of the Ottoman code. So codification was a death knell for the Sharia-based legal system. It was considered a noble act if you could give away your money in the cause of God. These educational institutions were supported by these charitable endowments, is what Waqf is.
A lot of them were led by women.
A lot of them. So in Egypt, over half of these Waqf endowments were operated or owned by women. The property was owned by women. So the colonizers took that property, either defunded it, defunded the schools. So it was how colonization takes away the resources of the colonized people. So that is what happened. There is no more Sharia legal system left in the world, but it is considered one of the three major legal systems in world history, if you define legal systems as those which operated for a long time and went beyond their original geographical area.
What are the other two? Do you know?
Roman law and English common law. And
Yeah.
what's ironic is that English common law was almost certainly influenced by Islamic law. And this is not something that we are taught in law school, because nobody likes to give credit to somebody else. But our American common law system is based on the English. Now, in the 12th century, Henry II wanted to overhaul the legal system in England, because at that time they were still doing trials by fire and trials by water, where you would just throw the accused into the water, and if they drowned, they were innocent, and if they floated, they were guilty. So he wanted to overhaul the legal system in England. He was a Norman king. The only other Norman king in the world was in Sicily, Roger II. And so these two Norman kings were friends. They exchanged court personnel. Roger was ruling over a country, Sicily, which had been ruled by Muslims for 200 years. And so a lot of the Sharia court infrastructure was still there. There were still Muslims in Sicily who were allowed to go to their Sharia courts. And so Roger knew how the Sharia legal system worked. When Henry was trying to overhaul his system, it can't be a coincidence that he put in place a case law system like the Sharia system. The rest of Europe followed Roman civil law. Why was England such an outlier? Why did it form this common law system? That's the answer.
I heard somewhere that the jury system of 11 people actually came from the Maliki School of Law and was adopted by the Europeans because it was such a great system.
Also, like, so many of the principles that we think of as our legal principles, like everyone has a right to a trial, like the right not to incriminate oneself, no illegal searches and seizures. Those are all principles in the Islamic system.
The U.S. Supreme Court featured the frieze of Prophet Muhammad as one of the history's greatest lawmakers. Why would they do that unless they really thought that the law that he had given to people was not incompatible with American law?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to note that the Prophet had 10,000 followers by the end of his death, and he could have been autocratic. He could have made himself a king, but he didn't.
He had the Medina Charter, which protected every community. So talk about pluralism, democracy, and the protection of all religions. It was all there in his Medina Charter.
Prophet Muhammad and his followers were persecuted in Mecca, and they fled to Medina. Medina was already having problems because they had lots of different political factions in the city, and they needed an outside leader to take over. So they entered into what's called the Constitution of Medina, which Muslims consider the oldest constitution in the world. It's more like a treaty, but what it essentially says is that all the different groups in Medina had a duty to defend the city, and that Prophet Muhammad would be the political leader of the city, but the religious leader of only the Muslims. All the other religious groups would look to their own religious authorities. So there was no imposition of Islam on people who were not Muslim.
It's fascinating. That was 1446 after the
Yeah.
death of the Prophet. So I wanted to end with this persistent, emotionally charged accusation against Sharia that it subjugates women. How do you reconcile the fact that Sharia granted women rights in 7th century that
Mhm.
Western women have only gained in the last century?
Yeah. So Norman Daniel was a historian, and one of the things he said in his writing was that it is justly said that Prophet Muhammad and the Quran gave women more rights in the 7th century than English women would have for another 1,000 years. And it is remarkable, right? So every so often someone will say, oh, the Quran is not feminist. And I just look at them like, of course it is feminist. It is feminist for the 7th century.
It's even feminist by today's standard because we have all the rights that we now consider to be human rights.
I think it is very easy to look at certain verses of the Quran and say that women do not have equal rights. So, for example, in the inheritance verses in the Quran, if a person dies and leaves a son and a daughter, the son gets 2/3 and the daughter gets 1/3. So someone could say, oh, see, that's not equal rights. But you have to look again in Islamic law, you always look at the reason for revelation. And what was the reason for revelation? It was that the son was the head of the tribe. The son went to war. The son protected the entire tribe, and the daughter didn't.
Mhm.
So she didn't need as much money. However, a third was a shocking amount in those days. And for those of you who have read Pride and Prejudice, which was written in the 19th century, you'll know that for many English women didn't get anything. Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters got nothing from their father. It all went to the odious Mr. Collins.
Because men were the landowners and women got nothing, even though we talk about this kind of unequal inheritance laws, when you really tease it out, it's not unequal because women don't have the obligation to spend on
Well,
themselves while
yeah,
men have the
and I think
obligation to be the
and I
provider. So it's why, Sumbul, it's why we have unequal system for pay for men and women in the United States, which people have been fighting for ever since.
that's very true.
I would get paid less than my coworker who was a man. It's the
Yeah,
same logic behind it.
or that's the reason that we have not yet had a woman president in the United States, even though we have the world has seen 17 Muslim women who have been presidents
Yeah.
or prime
Yeah.
ministers just in the modern era. And that is a remarkable thing too. As of the time I wrote my book, there were 18 countries that had more women in their legislatures than the United States did.
Mm.
So there's no question that there is sexism and inequality throughout the world. It does not have to do with religion. The single factor affecting the status of women, according to one study that I cite in my book, is poverty. So going back to the inheritance verses, the way that the fiqh worked, we always looked at the reason for revelation, and the reason for that verse is that the son needed more money at the time, and 1/3 was a huge amount for the 7th century. So we can't use that to oppress women now. Now that verse can be reinterpreted because the reason for revelation is no longer there. For if I have a son and daughter, my son is not going to go off and take care of the tribe and go to war and have to pay for all of that. My daughter, I hope, has as much of a chance of success as my son, and therefore it's okay for me to leave half and half.
Yeah. It was also at a time when women didn't work, right? So today women are working and they have needs and they have their financial commitments, and many women are single, and if they are the only daughter, they get all of it and they get to share that with their mother and grandmother, whatever. In closing, I wanted those American listeners who may still feel a little confused. What's the single most important thing you can say to them?
Well, I always tell people, I tell Muslims this too, that if you're confused about what Sharia means, it really just means Islam. That's the 5-minute definition. I think the single most important thing is to understand that in the West, there's a long historical tradition of viewing Muslims as the enemy. And this is because in Western Europe, they didn't know any Muslims. They only met them on the battlefield. To them, Islam was a false religion because of how couldn't it have been? And so there grew up an entire mythology of tall tales about Muslims that are still with us today. We still view Muslims through the lens of the enemy. And that's why we have such a distorted lens. The same misconceptions we see in our movies, television, books. I come across stereotypes in cookbooks. It permeates our culture. So it's easy for people to believe it because there's already this cultural view of Muslims as the enemy. So next time you hear something about Islam and Muslims, think twice. Is this just another bogeyman story? Don't go to the internet. Maybe ask someone who has credentials to explain what's going on.
And so to the listeners, next time you hear someone shout about Sharia taking over, remember, fear is easy, and the real threat to this country aren't the 2 billion people practicing the Islamic faith. It's an industry that's profiting from keeping us afraid of each other. And like Sumbul's book says, think of the Muslim living next door. They are doctors, teachers, your small business owner. They're paying taxes, coaching little league, and living completely ordinary American lives.
Can I say one thing?
Of course.
The one thing that I always tell people is when you're comparing Muslim women, don't compare American women who are not Muslim to Muslim women over there in poverty-struck countries. Compare American Muslim women with non-Muslim American women so that you're comparing apples to apples, right? And then you find that Muslim American women are doing very well. They're the second most educated group in the country, faith group. They have the most parity of income with men of any faith group in the country. And think of the 17 Muslim women presidents and prime ministers in the modern era.
And if there's anything that you can do, listeners, get to know a Muslim personally. That will change your perspective, and that will remove the fear of the unknown. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Sumbul, for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daisy. It was so much fun.
Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you. And definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter. And your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. So let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.